Welcome to Lecture 4 in the series Philosophy for Living. Before I start the main part of this lecture, I want to go back to our last lecture and just mention one or two things. As I listened back, I was aware that I hadn't actually addressed any complications in relation to genetic inheritance in relation to biological sex. Part of that has to do with that I don't want to go down a rabbit hole in relation to gender identification and transgender issues, which are very much in the public eye at the moment, and there's a lot of argumentation and distress and that, and it's not a central part of our conversation here in this lecture series. But in doing so, I may have just appeared to not recognize that with anything as complex as genetics, that there are certain situations which don't particularly fit the model of basic male-female. Again, going back to the idea, the issues in relation to chromosomes, I was also aware as I was speaking about it that I was talking about an XY chromosome as if it's one chromosome, and of course it's not. And I have to think historically about the virtue that we have now of knowledge and scientific understandings of genetics. And I think that poor Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII's wives that met their doom because of his distress that they wouldn't provide him with a son. If he had known anything about genetics, he would have realized that this was his problem, not theirs. The mother, the female, the egg always carries an X chromosome. The male sperm carries either a Y chromosome or an X chromosome. When the egg is fertilized by the sperm, if the sperm is carrying an X chromosome, then you've got a double X chromosome in the fetus, and that's a female. If the sperm is carrying a Y chromosome, then the fetus is going to be based on an X, the marriage of the X and Y chromosomes, and it will be male. However, like everything in life, there are defects and there are accidents and there are things that go wrong. And sometimes, as a result of genetic mutation or whatever, certain syndromes can arise. Probably the most obvious one is Klinefelter syndrome, whereby there's two X chromosomes and a Y chromosome. So it's a male with an extra X chromosome, and that leads to all kinds of problems physically, and it's a disorder of the person's biological sex. Turner syndrome is another one whereby the female actually loses an X chromosome, and that has serious difficulties as well. And then there's intersex, which is a complex issue. Intersex occurs in a very small number of people, something like 1 in 5,000, I think, is the kind of, if you stay within a very specific definition of intersex. This occurs when the body of the person is actually out of sync with their chromosomal program. So you get a situation where an XY chromosome would actually have ovaries, and whereas an XX chromosome would have a penis. So and again, these occur rarely, but they are there, and the people who experience these need to be recognized and validated. And I didn't want to leave any impression from what I was saying about it is that they don't matter. Of course they do. But in the general trend of what we're speaking about today, in general, for the vast majority of people, their sexual biological form is genetically given. So that's the first thing. And I think the other one was in relation to Hannah Arendt. I think at one point I mentioned that she left Germany in 1993, but actually, or 1933, but it was 1936. That was just a slip of the tongue. Okay, now we're going on to this next lecture, which is concerned with what we've called a constructed self and self-actualization. We're moving on from the situation where we've talked about the cave, we've talked about the influences, and we've talked about the things that we need in order to do an evaluation, to use our thinking and to educate ourselves. And then also to look at what are the primary influences that have created us to be who we are today. So we need to dig a bit deeper into this question. It's essential to the work we're doing here. I take a quotation from the Holocaust survivor and philosopher Elie Wiesel. He's a Jewish philosopher who famously wrote the book called Night, which is the story of Auschwitz. And he uses a nice metaphor. He says, when we die and go to heaven and we meet our Maker is not going to say to us, why didn't you become a Messiah? Why didn't you discover a cure for such and such? The only thing we're going to be asked at that precious moment is, why didn't you become you? Now that's an interesting one, because this brings us back then to the notion of the true self. Who are you? And in order to pursue that, we're going to make a distinction here between two very closely related concepts. One is called individuation, and the other is called individualism. And I'm going to rely on certain philosophers in relation to this discussion, because it's really important in terms of how we understand what it means to be a person in the modern, technologically driven world that we live in, with mass media and economies that are based on vast numbers of people working together, urban dwellers, cities, the development of the masses. And what does it mean to be a person in the midst of that? The people who've contributed best to our understanding of this, Carl Jung is a very important, and we'll use a fairly extensive quotation from Carl Jung as part of our discussion. We will also look at Abraham Maslow, and we will look at a kind of a way of tweaking his concept of self-actualization as something that we will see as a process and as a way of looking at how you can pursue this process called self-actualization or individuation. We're also going to look at two other philosophers, Søren Kierkegaard, who is a Danish philosopher, Christian, who famously, I suppose, essentially developed the notion of faith, that in terms of how do we deal with the growth of science and rationality and explaining everything through reason. Where's the room for faith, and how does our religious faith and our religious belief fit in a world that's becoming more mechanistic and more mechanical? And of course, Friedrich Nietzsche. You cannot really talk about the true self in any meaningful sense without looking at the extraordinary work and poetry and poetic work that his legacy leaves us. Okay, so these are largely complex. So the first distinction we need to make is the difference between individuation and individualism. So Carl Jung, I'm going to take a quotation from Carl Jung. He said, instead of moral and mental differentiation of the individual, you have public welfare and the raising of living standards, the goal and meaning of individual life, which is the only real life, no longer lie in individual development, but in the policy of the state, which is thrust upon the individual from the outside. The individual is increasingly deprived of the moral decision of how he should live his own life, and instead is ruled, fed, clothed, and educated as a social unit, accommodated in the appropriate housing unit, and amused in accordance with the standards that give pleasure and satisfaction to the masses. Now, this is an extraordinarily dense piece of writing, because he's got a lot of concepts here. He's basically got the concept of the moral and mental differentiation of the individual. So we bring in this idea of differentiation. Is how do we differentiate ourselves both morally and mentally from the group? And he says you have public welfare and the raising of living standards. So if we look at the progress of civilization in the Western world, we see that gradually over a period of time, the basic survival needs and living standards go up. Now, people can complain about this and say they don't go up far enough and there's still a lot of poverty and all of that. But relative to what we have come through, and you will recognize from our last conversation that what we mean by poor today is a very, very different thing than what it meant to be poor 100 years ago. As we said, you die from toothache 100 years ago. Nowadays, that's not the case, largely in the Western world. And the other thing I need to say is that a lot of the concepts that we're dealing with at the moment really sort of applying more to Western civilization, because the progress that we've been looking at in terms of actually the cherishing of the individual, that's where we're at. The cherishing. There are many situations globally where the cherishing of the individual is still not a priority. So, and so that's a different conversation. But this is a personal development course. It's not a course on global politics. So because it's a personal development course, this is where the focus is. It's on personal development. Like if you get up in the morning and you have nothing to eat, and you have to walk 10 miles to get some wood for a fire, so in order to actually boil some water that you had to walk another 4 miles for, and you spent half your day just barely trying to survive while somebody else is out there trying to hunt and find something to eat. And that by the time the night falls, you're living in a hut where nothing is going on and you're barely surviving. Personal development is irrelevant at that point in time. It's survival that's relevant at that time. So in the West, what's happened is we've moved on from that, and what we're doing in terms of civilization and progression is trying to get it to the place where fewer and fewer people have to experience that level of basic bare life survival. It would be absurd to be talking to somebody in that situation about their personal development. What you would want them to have is some good food, nutrition, shelter, and care. And as we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we will towards the end of this, we will be able to look more closely at that. So, just in case, because this is quite elitist to be talking about personal development, I understand that, but it's reality for our lives today in the West. That personal development is something that we have the privilege and the fortune to be able to talk about. And that's why I was so focused in the earlier session about understanding our history, so that we have an appreciation of how fortunate we are to be even able to talk about these things. But the difficulty lies now in, given that that has happened, given that the basic fundamental survival needs have been met, what is going on then in terms of how we become a person in our own right? And Jung is identifying something here. He's saying the difficulty now is that for the individual to differentiate themselves from the group, their basic fundamental survival needs are being met, and often met to a very large degree. He said the individual is increasingly deprived of the moral decision of how he should live his own life, and instead is ruled, fed, clothed, and educated as a social unit. So the person becomes like a subject, like we talked about Althusser, a subject, and he's accommodated, proper housing, whatever, and amused in accordance with the standards that give pleasure and satisfaction to the masses. So what Jung is referring to here now is a concept called the mass, or the masses. And many philosophers have identified this and recognized this, that being part of the mass is a particular way of living your life, but it's not your true life. It's a life or an identity that's given to you, but it's not uncomfortable. Largely, you're part of a social unit. Now, go back to Plato and see what he's saying about this. He's saying that there are people controlling this, ruling this. And of course, when we look at our society today, we think, well, how are people defined about in terms of who they are? So the masses is a concept which developed as people move more and more towards large centers of population that become more and more atomized. That's what it's called, being like little units in the big picture. But the big picture determines who they think they should be. One of the first people to really talk about this was Søren Kierkegaard. And his language is kind of archaic, but I need to, so I'll talk about it, but if you recognize that this is nearly 200 years ago. So he describes the effect of this. He said, man, because it was back then they didn't talk about women, but he means humanity, the individual human being. His self or he himself is a something with the other in the compass of the temporal and the worldly. What's he mean by that? Simply, basically, that the self connects with other people in the overall umbrella of the world that they're in. Thus the self, his self, coheres immediately with the other, wishing, desiring, enjoying, but passively. He manages to imitate the other men, noting how they manage to live, and so he too lives after a sort. In Christendom, he too is a Christian, goes to church every Sunday, hears and understands the parson. Yeah, they understand each other. He dies, and the parson introduces him to eternity for the price of $10. But as a self, he was not. And a self he did not become. For the immediate person or the immediate man does not recognize his self. He recognizes himself only by his dress. He recognizes that he has a self only by externals. So Kierkegaard is identifying that as civilization progressed, as people came in greater numbers, lived in the cities, worked, lived, died, that something was happening to the individual person. The individual person were taking all of their cues from their surroundings, and they were not becoming the human being that they could become. Forward 150 years to a philosopher called Herbert Marcuse. Now, Herbert Marcuse was part of a philosophical movement called the Frankfurt School, which developed in the 20s and 30s in Germany as a way of socially critiquing what was happening to society. And because most of them were Jewish, they got out of Germany because they could see the danger, and they went to New York initially and then to California. And they developed what's called critical theory. Now, their work in critical theory has been taken and expanded and extended, and it's right out there now, and has had a huge effect on academic life in terms of our understanding of culture and all of the different theories. Critical theory is about actually dismantling the basis for knowledge and understanding in the modern world about a lot of things. Don't want to go there today, but what I do want to talk about is their understanding of how culture, what they call the culture industry, shapes and in some way enslaves the individual. So they're taking the Kierkegaardian idea of the self being lost in the group or in the mass, and they are extending that a bit and explaining it in terms of the role the media take in particular in shaping how people define themselves. So Marcuse says that there is no reason to insist on self-determination if the administered life is the comfortable and even the good life. And if the individuals are preconditioned so that the satisfying goods also include thoughts, feelings, aspirations, why should they wish to feel or imagine for themselves? True, the material and mental consolations offered may be bad, wasteful, rubbish, but spirit and knowledge are no telling arguments against the satisfaction of their needs. So, Marcuse is bringing this another step from Kierkegaard. He's saying this is about cultivating the social unit that Jung talks about as well, and providing the comforts and the consolations. And if you get all of those needs satisfied, why should you have to think and feel for yourself? Why should you put yourself out there, as Plato talks about, and get out of the cave and put yourself through the distress? So for Marcuse, willing participation in one's own enslavement is a key element of his critique. And he continues, goods and services which satisfy the individual while rendering him incapable of achieving an existence of his own, unable to grasp the possibilities which are repelled by his satisfactions. Comfort, business, and job security in a society which prepares itself for and against nuclear war may serve as a universal example of enslaving contentment. That's a wonderful phrase, enslaving contentment. So now when we look at the issue of becoming who you are, the Nietzschean command, become who you are, Marcuse and the Frankfurt School are following on from Kierkegaard, and they're saying, why? Why would you bother? And that's a really good question. If you're happy, in fulfilled in your thing, and you're indulging your needs and you're getting them met and you're doing your thing, why step back and look at anything else? Well, people will say, okay, but then you say, well, I want to be myself. And you say, well, I am being myself doing that. This is the distinction between individuation and individualism. For the most part, people do not actually become themselves. They construct an identity. This is a constructed self. And they construct an identity to follow on from the social pressures and the social, what Marcuse calls enslavement, which gives them satisfaction. Philosopher Hawkes summarizes this. He says, a person may well construct his or her personality out of an amalgam of consumer goods, fashion statements, lifestyle choices, identification with real or functional celebrities, or fictional celebrities. In other words, objective phenomena which are administered to them by the culture industry. And yet this utter loss of subjectivity is combined in our society with a resounding emphasis on the individual in the uniqueness of each and every person. So here's the paradox. In societies whereby people are being upheld as being individual, it is a fiction. They feel that they are being individual because they're constructing a self. But it's a little bit like adolescence. The period of adolescence where people rebel against authority and they want to step out and establish their own identity. And when anybody who's been an adolescent knows what this is like. You think your parents know nothing, they knew nothing, they're from old fashioned, whatever. Whatever. I'm pushing it out there. I'm becoming myself. And as you're becoming yourself, you go off and you meet your friends who are also becoming themselves. And what do you see? They're all wearing the same clothes. They're all wearing the same shoes. They're all have the same haircut. They all have the, but they all are under the idea or under the notion that they're becoming themselves. So we have this drive to become ourselves, but where do we get the information to help us to know what that means? So the constructed self is the self that we construct, we make to present ourselves to the world. Carl Jung calls this the persona. The persona was the mask. It comes from Greek theatre, and the Latin for persona is based on the Latin word for power, which is through, and sona, which is to sound. So the mask was worn because you were sounding through the mask. The persona was the mask that you present to the world. You show yourself to the world through your persona. But sometimes you don't know the distinction between the person behind the mask and the persona that they're projecting. And the greater the chasm between those two aspects, the more difficult it is and the more confusing it is. So that would mean that for some people, they live their whole lives in that way. And they never realized that what they were doing throughout their whole lives was living according to the demands, the expectations of the crowd, the mass person. So getting lost in the mass, Nietzsche called this the herd. Nietzsche was very pessimistic about people. He considered that most human beings are that human beings are herd animals. And if you think about what a herd is, if you watch sort of David Attenborough, for example, and the great Serengeti, the migration of the Serengeti, Fascinating to watch that. The wildebeest has no personal identity. The unit of the wildebeest is a unit of the wildebeest herd. In fact, being an individual as a wildebeest is quite risky, because if you step out from the herd, you are likely to be eaten by the lions. The safety is in the herd. So Nietzsche felt that most human beings are like that because there's so much fear. They're afraid to be themselves. They're afraid to step up. It's much more comfortable to have somebody else tell you how to be in the world. And in part, I have sort of an empathy for that. And as I said in our first lecture, sometimes I kind of have a bit of an envy sometimes where people wander through their lives unthinkingly, seemingly unaware of all the possibilities that they've lost or missed or not interested in, and that they have that basic sense of everything is going to be all right. I'm still not sure whether that is true, that they actually really do feel that, because most of the people I deal with, because I work in the field of counselling and teaching and educating and mentoring and all of that, the people I deal with want to make some changes. They have an angst within themselves about something not working for them, something's going wrong. And so maybe they're a very select few. Maybe the unthinking masses are the norm. But I think they are to some extent, but that doesn't mean that they're happy. It doesn't mean that they're fulfilled. And if we look at mass culture, we see that people sway from one ideological frame to another. They can get involved in terrible mistreatment of other people. We look at genocide, we look at the turning of a population. Like Hannah Arendt talks about the German populace, how so easily corruptible they were, and they didn't even know that. And most of them were ordinary, decent human beings. Yet they ended up supporting the Nazi regime. Why? Because they had no individual identity that could withstand when the politics changed. When the world changed, they didn't have a strong enough sense of who they were to stand firm and say no. And that didn't mean that they had to go out and attack an SA thug. They could just have been a little bit less participatory. That would have slowed the whole thing down. But no. So Tuttle, who is a sociologist, he kind of summarizes all of this for us. And this is about individualism versus individuation. The idea of a self-creating mission is alienating to the mass person. Mass can enjoy no authentic destiny or vital project in life, and attempts at self-fabrication will be minimal. While the select person will always seek a vocation in concrete life, the mass person possesses no effective I, or his or her life consists of repeating the normative assumptions of the group. So what Tuttle is telling us here, based on his study of Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's idea of the herd, is saying that to become a person in this world is really, really difficult. It's much easier to stay in the herd. It's much easier to take all of your influences, get your core values, get your plan for your life from the menu that's offered to you through your family system, through the ideological state apparatus, the things we talked about. And then that's your life mapped out for you. So what's so wrong with that? I think anybody who actually believes that, first of all, the individual is important, and secondly, people have a right to choose how they should live their lives, have to acknowledge that if somebody wants to live like that and be predictable and stay safe and not think too much about anything, they have every right to do that. It can be problematic when an ideology or a system that they're in, the political system, changes, because they're not going to be able to change. They're going to feed whatever it is that's going on. They'll be part of foot soldiers, but that's not my concern. This is a personal development course, so if you're doing this course, you're not one of those people. You want to step away. You want to transcend that. You want to find something that has deeper, more fulfillment for you. But as we see, part of that is to recognize the distinction between individualism. And individualism is, yeah, I'm me, but it's fiction. It's not true individuality. It's I'm buying into what it means to be a successful individual in the world that I'm living in. So I'm taking all the cues, whether it's fashion statements, the clothes I wear, whether it's the kind of people I want to hang around with, to be seen with, whether it's how I define myself as successful. There's nothing wrong with any of those, but have you really chosen them? Have you sat back and actually said, this is who I want to be? And if so, then that's a different thing. So you can get somebody who is a successful, whatever, entrepreneur or a successful plumber. That person went, got a trade, does his plumbing job. One person is doing that because that's what they were told how to be. Another person doing this because they actually love plumbing. There's a difference. You're in a marriage. You're married because, and this is less, I suppose, less coercive than it used to be. Why are you married to the person you're married to? Did you marry somebody because you thought, right, okay, I need to have that reliability or that safety or whatever that is? What's the basis for the decision? So you can get two people married, two married people, not married to each other, married to other people, one whose marriage is based on something that really sat very well with them, really was actually coming out of their own sense of self-reflection and who they were, and this is how they want to define themselves in the world, and somebody else who says, well, actually, this is the norm, this is what you're supposed to do. And onwards and upwards in every single aspect of our lives, all the big core areas of our lives, we say to what extent was this a self-creation of mine? To what extent have I really truly chosen this path? Or have I let this just be something that I went along with? And oftentimes the thing that makes us change our minds about stuff like that has to do with emotional pain, or a feeling of emptiness or nihilism, or a feeling of angst, a feeling of purposelessness. So if you're getting those feelings, then it's probably saying to you something about the way you're living in the world. Carl Jung basically says the way we understand this is that we all have we have a conscience, a voice. Now we'll go back to our first session. We talked about Socrates and the internal conversation, the internal sort of the two-in-one conversation, the voice of conscience that says, Michael, this is not actually the way you should be living your life. You may need to make some changes here because this isn't really you. So we're going to now look at, well, how do you tap into that? Because that's to do with individuation. Individuation is not just creating an identity out of the powers, out of all the influences that are there, but actually being able to take that step back and say, right, well, how do I know? How do I do that evaluation? So, individuation means becoming who you're meant to be. We can kind of call it that. Now, of course, if you say, that's got its own implication. You say, well, who you're meant to be, does that mean that you're meant to be, that where did you get that idea from? Is that something from the beginning of the universe, that I'm in this world and I have a purpose that I'm supposed to fulfill? That's certainly a model that many, many people use. But we don't have to have that view to still understand that individuation, because you are a human being with so this has to do, I suppose, in some ways with a highly, very, very high view of a human being. That within that human being there are all kinds of possibilities that can be explored. So this was what Abraham Maslow meant by self-actualization. And he saw self-actualization, this is where we go to now in terms of individuation versus individualism. He saw it as having four elements. A fuller knowledge and acceptance of your intrinsic nature. Fuller knowledge and acceptance of your intrinsic nature. Now we've done some work on that. Understanding yourself. We've looked at it from the point of view of, being able to be aware of aspects of life you came in with, which is your genetic inheritance, and the effect of your experiences on that and how that brought you to where you are today. But the idea here is you have an intrinsic nature and knowledge of that and an acceptance of it. Now, it's very important here because Maslow was very optimistic. I'm not as optimistic as Maslow is, because he says about acceptance. Now, when I hear the word acceptance, this is something that people can think acceptance is the same as tolerance or justification. I don't believe that. Acceptance means, to my mind, recognition. That is the state of play. I'm recognizing this in myself. Because if we do the analysis and if we do the awareness of ourselves, we're going to find things that are actually not so pretty. Carl Jung calls this the shadow. He says every human being has a shadow. And the more we deny our shadow, the more difficulty we're going to be in. The shadow is the dark side of ourselves. The optimists, the humanistic optimists, have this, what I call the flower theory of the human being, which is that it's like a flower. You put the flower in the flower bed, and if you feed it, you get sunshine, and it gets fertilizer, and it gets nutrients, and it'll grow towards the light, and it'll grow into this beautiful flower automatically, because the flower it's intrinsically, that's what it is. I don't think it's that simple for human beings, because we have a dark side as well. So recognizing our shadow is important. Recognizing that and accepting it is important. That doesn't mean that we don't want to change it. It doesn't mean that we want to actually say, yeah, I recognize that. I recognize, for example, that I'm somebody who can get very jealous. Now, it's interesting. I take the example of jealousy, because thankfully that's not part of my shadow. I've got my own ones, but I'm not going to share them with you today. But I'm intrigued by how jealousy works for people. There are some people for whom jealousy is a real problem. It seems so toxic for them, and unless they get to understand it and accept it and recognize it as something that's there in their lives and manage it and temper it and work with it, because you see, if you deny it, you don't work with it. That's the problem. You deny it, you blame somebody else. You say, well, if you didn't look over the bar at that person, then I wouldn't have had to hate you. Horrendous. And jealousy is so toxic for people. So we can accept that we suffer with jealousy, but that doesn't mean that justifies us in how we behave or gives us justification for damaging or hurting somebody else. In fact, if anything, it's something we need to be saying, I accept that I have this problem called jealousy, and I'd like to do something about it. So self-knowledge and a fuller knowledge and acceptance of what the state of play is the first piece, and an important part, an ongoing part of self-actualization. Now, the second thing is that self-actualization is a process that goes on for the rest of your life. This is not like, oh, I'm going to get self-actualized. So the implication in some of the more optimistic notions about self-actualization is that you can actualize anything. Like, if I think about self-actualization in relation to somebody like Reinhold Heydrich, in many, many ways, Heydrich was very self-actualized, but he was one of the most evil people in the world, because he actualized aspects of his self that he shouldn't have. I'm making a value judgment. I'm saying you shouldn't have done that. So positive self-actualization is actualizing the positives, the things that we hold to be life-enhancing. And murdering Jews is not life-enhancing. So the second one, ongoing, that's the process. Actualization of talents, capacities, and potentials. The first is self-awareness. The second is then taking, look, what have you got in the bag? What have you got in yourself that you want to make real in the world? Whatever that is. Understanding and getting a sense of those, and getting a clearer idea of these aspects of yourself, and setting out a path to develop them. Talents, the things that you can do. Some people have a talent for making things with their hands. Other people have a talent for analysing abstract ideas. Some people are musically talented. Some people are very caring and kind and make other people feel at ease. Some people are magical when it comes to creativity. And say, well, what are these capacities that you have? How do you know what those are? And what are you doing about them? Are you consistently nourishing and developing those aspects of yourself? The third is a consistent trend towards ongoing growth and maturation. It's about, I want to be a better person next year than I am this year. I want to expand my horizons. I want to be wiser. And the fourth is following or fulfilling a sense of purpose in life or a vocation. This sense, I want something to mark out my life. I want to be devoted to something. I want to have a sense of purpose. And that could be that sense of purpose could be to leave something behind that's really worthwhile. It could be that I want my children, because we're going to have a whole session on purpose in life. But it's about identifying some life task that says, I wouldn't feel complete unless I actually had done something useful in that way. So this is all very active. This is engaging with life, but it's freeing up a place to become you, rather than drowning in the constant stimulation of the way that the world feeds and takes your energy. And this has to do with entertainment. Juvenal, the Roman poet, famously said about the masses, in order to keep them happy, you just need to give them bread and circuses. And that's 2,000 years ago. Bread and circuses, what does that mean? It means material needs and entertainment. And if you give that to a lot of people, they'll stay stuck. The problem with being stuck is they're easily manipulated, and they can be easily manipulated into very bad things. So what can we do to help us to get a clearer view? So individualism we've taken care of. Now we're looking at individuation, and we're looking at self-actualization. We can see the 4 different aspects of it. And as you reflect on these, you think, well, okay, how can I tap into this? How can I put some meat on the bones of this? There are 4 exercises that I'm suggesting that you can take away from this lecture with. The first comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, who, as we said, is pessimistic about human beings, who feels that most people are lost in a herd and that they don't have the courage to actually step out and become themselves. He says the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. What an extraordinary phrase. The privilege of owning yourself. So this is what we're about here. And he did this exercise. Now, before we continue, I want to go back to Heidegger again, and I want to just recognize that the 2 elements the 2 faculties that you're going to be using in these exercises are your memory and your imagination. These are 2 faculties human beings have to help in this journey. Because for Heidegger, the past and the future, you're at the nodal point. And what the past can give you is it can give you data, information that can help you. Your imagination, because it's a capacity to imagine or to create a world that's not here right now, but in your imagination, you can create it. Stephen Covey, I think, made a very interesting comment once. He said, everything has been created twice. First time it's been in somebody's imagination, like the chair I'm looking at over there, or the microphone, or the watch that I'm using. Somebody created that in their imagination before they made it a reality. So this relationship between imagination and reality, this is what helps us as human beings to progress in our lives, not just as individuals, but generally the progress of civilization is hugely contributed by the capacity to imagine something. That's what literature is all about, of course. That's why I'm always recommending you to read literature. It'll help your imagination to grow. So you need your imagination for these exercises, and you need your memory. These are the 2 faculties we're relying on. First is called the eternal recurrence. And Nietzsche says, what if someday or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness, and say to you, This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself, the eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal? Eternal confirmation and seal. The confirmation that the life you've lived, the life that you're living, is the one that you would want to recur again and again and again. So the Nietzschean challenge here is, when you do that exercise, when you imagine that demon saying to you, this is what you are now cursed with, you have to do it again and again, would you gnash your teeth and say, oh no? Or would you say, oh yes? When you look at this and think about it, what changes do you need to make so that if that came to you, you would be able to say, yeah, I want to do that again? And the way you do that is through your memory, because you look back and you say, these are the parts that I really, really wish to repeat. And these are things that I certainly could have done without. There's a kind of there's a Pollyanna idea out there that there's no such thing as a mistake. There's only evidence. I read it in some self-help book anyway. That's ridiculous. So we've got to keep our minds active and keep our reason working here. There are mistakes. There are things we do that were just wrong or terribly destructive, really damaging to our lives. And the key thing is not to keep making the same mistakes. And we will talk a little bit about why this happens. So we look back and we say, I learned from that. The best we can do, because the past is over, is learn from these things. This is what the reflection piece, reflective thinking is. What did I learn about myself in that situation? I think it's sort of ironic sometimes that you meet people who've been through 2 or 3 marriages, and they say the same things about the third wife or the third husband as they did about the first husband or the first one. And the one thing that they're doing is they're pointing at the other person as being the one with the problem. But you say, okay, well, if you've married the same, well, what's been going on here? This is saying more about you than it is about them. Something in you is attracting you to people who have this stuff going on, and you don't know what it is. So when you don't know what it is, you don't know that it's controlling you, but it's actually damaging your life, probably damaging the other person's life too. So our memory gives us, that's the faculty for learning. Look back and think about Nietzsche's recurrence thing and say, no, I would like to have a life that doesn't have that stuff and does have more of this. Another exercise you can do that helps you with this growing awareness of how do you track the person you need to become as you individuate. Childhood fantasy. So children have not been, as children, we still have a lot of freedom in our thinking and our imagination, because it hasn't been taken out of us for the most part. We still will use our fantasy and our imagination to create pictures in our minds before we actually get overly rational. And I think it's Thomas More talks about, he talks about the oak is in the acorn, which I think is a lovely metaphor. The acorn, the oak is in the acorn. All that the oak tree is going to be, it's already there in the acorn. And I think about childhood. There are aspects of ourselves which are more freely available to us as children. And we think about what are the experiences as children that excited us, that where we were enthusiastic, what kind of dreams did we have? Even if they're mad dreams, like if you wanted, like I remember as a child a fantasy about when I was in the Boy Scouts at a very young age, but it was in 8 or 9 or 10, and I wanted to kind of set up a gang of motorcycle Boy Scouts as distinct from Hell's Angels. But our job was to go around the world fixing people. So I used to go to bed at night and I dream about this and I think about who'd be in my gang and, that's what we do. I think I was about 8 or 9. I don't know, maybe less. Can't remember quite. Probably less because at 9 I was becoming very rational. I used to dream about that and I thought, that's interesting. What am I doing today here, nearly 60 years later? What do I do with my day-to-day life? I go around the world helping people out. So inside, and I'm delighted. That's I feel so privileged. So inside that little fantasy, so you'll have memories. So you look back and go down memory lane and think about the things that used to excite you, and just reflect and see: is there a nugget? Is there a little bit of nugget of information there that you can take hold of and say, what would the adult version of that be? That can help. A third is recalling peak experiences. Maslow talked about self-actualized people as people who experience what he called peak experiences, experiences that help them, that not to help them, but experiences they have that confirm for them that they are in the right place, a sense of complete satisfaction, fulfillment, and joy. Probably the nearest peak experience most people have would be after sex with someone they love. Maybe after sex anyway, but certainly after sex with someone I love. That sense of the collapse of the ego boundaries. This is a sort of a spiritual experience of oneness, of unity with the world. So peak experiences are those that where you feel like you truly are where you need to be. And you may have had some of those experiences. I remember I went on a holiday once down the Nile in a boat, and the first day there, I just sat and I looked, and I was overwhelmed with a feeling of gratitude that I could be so fortunate. I mean, this was a package tour. There were people there that were complaining about the fact that the boat was rusty, and it was very funny. I'll tell you a quick story about this. We were visiting, I think it was the Temple of Komombo. I can't remember which of the ones on the Nile tour, and the tour guide was talking about, I was looking at the columns, and there's these marks on the columns. And he was telling us that these marks on the were the Roman centurions used to sharpen their swords on the columns. And of course, I had this extraordinary picture here of these. I could hear the snorting of the horses. I could see the plumes of the, and all the stuff, the chariots, and my imagination was going on everything, it's wow, and I was just taken away by it. I was standing there thinking about that. And then I heard a voice behind me, that one man said to his wife, they're all the same, really, innit? It's all the same, really, innit? And I just went, so different people have different expectations, I guess. But it was a peak experience. Why was that such a wonderful experience for me? Because I fought very hard and worked very hard to try and establish and try to get an education. At a time in Ireland when, there wasn't as much value on education as and I was in the cradle of civilization, and I just was so touched by that. That's because learning for me is such a central part of who I am. But the guy behind me who thought that, they're all the same, innit? He didn't have that. He didn't have a peak experience there. He was bored and whatever. That's fine. And I'm sure that there are other things he could have been so excited about doing that I know nothing about. So those kind of evocative memories are important because you think, what is it saying about you? Most of these experiences, that they say something about the person you are, and you've got to listen to that voice. That will help you to recognize who you want to become. And a fourth thing that you can do in relation to this is you can write your obituary. This sounds very morose, doesn't it? Well, it's only morose if we kind of live in denial that we're going to die. But writing an obituary, I think is very useful because you're going to write into that obituary what you want people to think about when you're dead. You want to be able, when you write that, you're writing it in such a way that you're tapping into the things that you really believe are the values that you have as a person, the things you want to live for. Because when you're not here anymore, what you've lived for, that's what's important today, what you want to live for. Hannah Arendt talks about the difference between eternal life and immortality. And immortality was always and ever the main thing until Christianity came along, and then it became eternal life. Immortality was the feeling that you had left something immortal behind you, whether that was a wall you built in your garden, whether that was something that you know, or your beautiful children, or whatever that is. You've left something behind, some mark on the world. Whereas eternal life is very different. It's a much better deal, which is you're not going to die anyway. You're just going to move on to the next life. So that distinction, if we stay with the immortality bit for this exercise rather than the eternal life bit, because the eternal life bit is what do you want to be when you get to meet your maker, which we started our conversation here with, which is that he's going to ask you, or she's going to ask you, or whatever it is, that whatever the deity that you adore is going to ask you, why didn't you become you? But let's assume for a moment that we're not going to depend on that. Let's assume for a moment that when your funeral is there and somebody that you choose to, and that's an important piece of your obituary, who would you choose to actually speak on your behalf? And what does that mean? What is that saying about you? And as you write it, you think, this is what I want to be leaving behind. Those exercises are going to bring you into a sense of awareness of who you are and who you truly want to be and the future you want to create. In our next session, we're going to look at what you're going to need to create that. What is freedom? How free are we? We can have dreams. I could have had all kinds of dreams to be a basketball player. Yeah, I could. You know. Or I could have wanted to be a rocket scientist. Either. I couldn't have done either. I tried reading Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time. He wrote that for simple people, simple folks that we'd understand what he's talking about. Can't get it still. So I can't be a basketball player and I can't be a rocket scientist. But I can be me. And you can be you. So I hope this has been helpful to you. And in our next session, I'm going to look at freedom, empowerment, how you're going to use your resources to get to where you need to get to. And until then, take care of yourself.